Continuing the Varieties of Religious Experience, a study in human nature by William James. We are in the reality of the unseen and going in its neighborhood. It might be consciously determined to different attitudes and tendencies. Such a bar of iron could never give you an outward description of the agencies that had the power of stirring it so strongly, yet of their presence and of their significance for its life. It would be intensely aware through every fiber of its being. It is not only the ideas of pure reason, as Kant styled them, that have this power of making us vitally feel presences that we are impotent articulately to describe. All sorts of higher abstractions bring with them the same kind of impalpable appeal. Remember those passages from Emerson, which I read at my last lecture? The whole universe of concrete objects as we know them swims not only for such a transcendentalist writer, but for all of us in a wider and higher universe of abstract ideas that lend it its significance. As time, space, and the ether soak through all things, so we feel do abstract and essential goodness, beauty, strength, significance, justice soak through all things good, strong, significant, and just. Such ideas and others equally abstract form the background for all our facts, the fountainhead of all the possibilities we can conceive of. They give its nature, as we call it, to every special thing. Everything we know is what it is by sharing in the nature of one of these abstractions. We can never look directly at them, for they are bodiless and featureless and footless, but they grasp all other things by their means. And in handling the real world, we should be stricken with helplessness, and just so far forth as we might lose these mental objects, these adjectives and adverbs and predicates and heads of classification and conception. This absolute determinability of our mind by abstractions is one of the cardinal facts in our human constitution, polarizing and magnetizing us as they do. We turn towards them and from them. We seek them, hold them, hate them, bless them, just as if they were so many concrete beings. And beings they are, beings as real in the realm which they inhabit as the changing things of sense are in the realm of space. Plato gave so brilliant and impressive a defense of this common human feeling that the doctrine of the reality of abstract objects has been known as the Platonic theory of ideas ever since. The doctrine of the reality of abstract objects has been known as the Platonic theory of ideas ever since. Abstract beauty, for example, is, for Plato, a perfectly definite individual being, of which the intellect is aware as of something additional to all the perishing beauties of earth. The true order of going, he says, in the often quoted passage in his Banquet, is to use the beauties of earth as steps along which one mounts upwards for the sake of that other beauty, going from one or two, and from two to all fair forms, and from fair forms to fair actions, and from fair actions to fair notions, until from fair notions he arrives at the notion of absolute beauty, and at last knows what the essence of beauty is. Symposium, Jowett, 1871, 1, 527. In our last lecture, we had a glimpse of the way in which a Platonizing writer like Emerson may treat the abstract divineness of things, the moral structure of the universe, as a fact worthy of worship. In those various churches without a God which today are spreading throughout the world under the name of ethical societies, we have a similar worship of the abstract divine, the moral law believed in as an ultimate object. Science in many minds is genuinely taking the place of religion. Where this is so, the scientist treats the laws of nature as an objective fact to be revered, as objective facts to be revered. A brilliant school of interpretation of Greek mythology would have it that in their origin, the Greek gods were only half metaphoric personifications of those great spheres of abstract law and order into which the natural world falls apart, the sky sphere, the ocean sphere, the earth sphere, and the like, just as even now we may speak of the simile of the morning, the kiss of the breeze. Oh, the smile of the morning, the kiss of the breeze, or the bite of the cold, without really meaning that these phenomena of nature actually wear a human face. For example, nature is always so interesting under whatever aspect she shows herself, that when it rains I seem to see a beautiful woman weeping. She appears the more beautiful, the more afflicted she is, says Buddhist Saint Pierre. As regards the origin of the Greek gods, we need not at present seek an opinion, but the whole array of our instances leads to a conclusion something like this. It is as if there were in the human consciousness a sense of reality, a feeling of objective presence, a perception of what we may call something there, more deep and more general than any of the special and particular senses by which the current psychology supposes existent realities to be originally revealed. If this were so, we might suppose the senses to waken our attitudes and conduct as they so habitually do, by first exciting this sense of reality. But anything else, any idea, for example, that might similarly excite it, would have that same prerogative of appearing real which objects of sense normally possess. So far as religious conceptions were able to touch this reality feeling, they would be believed in spite of criticism, even though they might be so vague and remote as to be almost unimaginable, even though they might be such non-entities in point of whatness as Kant makes the objects of his moral theology to be. The most curious proofs of the existence of such an undifferentiated sense of reality as this are found in experiences of hallucination. It often happens that an hallucination is imperfectly developed. The person affected will feel a presence in the room, definitely localized, facing in one particular way, real in the most emphatic sense of the word, often coming suddenly, and as suddenly gone, and yet neither seen, heard, touched, nor cognized in any of the usual sensible ways. Of course, if we broaden our definition of hallucination, we can say the psychiatric experiences that aren't universal in every instance would be that by psychedelic is more the term, but not necessarily using drugs, because we have over 50 chemicals that we know nowadays that produce drug-like highs. Some of these are visual, and some of them are ways of perceiving, some of them are sensual, Let me give you an example of this before I pass to the objects with whose presence religion is more peculiarly concerned. An intimate friend of mine, one of the keenest intellects I know, has had several experiences of this sort. He writes as follows in response to my inquiries, and is this all going to be in the Journal of the SPR, February 1895, page 26? No, that's another quote. Okay. I have several times within the past few years felt the so-called consciousness of a presence. The experiences which I have in mind are clearly distinguishable from another kind of experience which I have had very frequently, and which I fancy many persons would also call the consciousness of a presence. But the difference for me between the two sets of experiences is as great as the difference between feeling a slight warmth originating I know not where and standing in the midst of a conflagration with all the ordinary senses alert. It was about September 1884 when I had the first experience. On the previous night I had, after getting into bed, At my rooms in college, a vivid tactile hallucination of being grasped by the arm, which made me get up and search the room for an intruder, but the sense of presence, properly so-called, came on the next night. After I had got into bed and blown out the candle, I lay awake a while, thinking on the previous night's experience, when suddenly I felt something come into the room and stay close to my bed. It remained only a minute or two. I did not recognize it by any ordinary sense, and yet there was a horribly unpleasant sensation connected with it. It stirred something more at the roots of my being than any ordinary perception. The feeling had something of the quality of a very large, tearing, vital pain, spreading chiefly over the chest, but within the organism, and yet the feeling was not the pain so much as abhorrence. At all events, something was present with me, and I knew its presence far more surely than I had ever known the presence of any fleshly living creature. I was conscious of its departure, of its coming, and almost instantaneously swift going through the door, and the horrible sensation disappeared. On the third night, when I retired, my mind was absorbed in some lectures which I was preparing, and I was still absorbed in these when I became aware of the actual presence, though not of the coming of the thing that was there the night before, and of the horrible sensation. I then mentally concentrated all my effort to charge this thing. If it was evil, to depart. If it was not evil, to tell me who or what it was. And if it could not explain itself, to go, and that I would compel it to go. It went as on the previous night, and my body quickly recovered its normal state. On 2 other occasions in my life, I have had precisely the same horrible sensation. Once it lasted a full quarter of an hour. In all 3 instances, the certainty that there, in outward space, there stood something was indescribably stronger than the ordinary certainty of companionship when we are in the close presence of ordinary living people. The something seemed close to me and intensely more real than any ordinary perception, although I felt it to be like unto myself, so to speak, or finite, small, distressful, as it were. I didn't recognize it as any individual being or person. Of course, such an experience as this does not connect itself with the religious sphere, yet it may upon occasion do so, and the same correspondent informs me that, at more than one other conjecture, he had the sense of presence developed with an equally intense and abruptness. He had the sense of presence developed with equal intensity and abruptness. Only then it was filled with a quality of joy. There was not a mere consciousness of something there, but fused in the central happiness of it, a startled awareness of some ineffable good, not vague either, like the emotional effect of some poem or scene or blossom of music, but the sure knowledge of the close presence of a sort of mighty person, and after it went, the memory persisted as the one perception of reality. Everything else might be a dream, but not that. My friend, as it oddly happens, does not interpret these latter experiences theistically as signifying the presence of God, but it would clearly not have been unnatural to interpret them as a revelation of the deity's existence. When we reach the subject of mysticism, we shall have much more to say upon this head. Lest the oddity of these phenomena should disconcert you, I will venture to read you a couple of similar narratives, much shorter, merely to show that we are dealing with a well-marked natural kind of fact. In the first case, which I take from the Journal of the Society for Psychical Research, the sense of presence developed in a few moments into a distinctly visualized hallucination. But I'll leave that part of the story out. And so, from the Journal of the SPR, February 1895, page 26, I had read, the narrator says, some 20 minutes or so, was thoroughly absorbed in the book. My mind was perfectly quiet. and for the time being my friends were quite forgotten, when suddenly, without a moment's warning, my whole being seemed roused to the highest state of tension or aliveness, and I was aware with an intenseness not easily imagined by those who had never experienced it, that another being or presence was not only in the room, but quite close to me. I put my book down, and although my excitement was great, I felt quite collected, and not conscious of any sense of fear. Without changing my position, and looking straight at the fire, I knew somehow that my friend A.H. was standing at my left elbow, but so far behind me as to be hidden by the armchair in which I was leaning back. Moving my eyes round slightly without otherwise changing my position, the lower portion of one's leg became visible, and I instantly recognized the gray-blue material of trousers he often wore, but the stuff appeared semi-transparent, reminding me of tobacco smoke, inconsistency, and hereupon the visual hallucination came. Another informant writes, according to E. Gurney, Phantasms of the Living, 1, page 384. Quite early in the night I was awakened. I felt as if I had been aroused intentionally, and at first thought someone was breaking into the house. I then turned on my side to go to sleep again, and immediately felt the consciousness of a presence in the room, and singular to state, it was not the consciousness of a live person, but of a spiritual presence. This may provoke a smile, but I can only tell you the facts as they occurred to me. I do not know how to better describe my sensations than by simply stating that I feel a consciousness of a spiritual presence. I felt also at the same time a strong feeling of superstitious dread, as if something strange and fearful were about to happen. Professor Flournoy of Geneva gives me the following testimony of a friend of his, a lady who has the gift of automatic or involuntary writing. Now you can practice that. Same thing with the involuntary speaking or, well, the glossolalia stuff, you know. Whenever I practice automatic writing, what makes me feel that it is not due to a subconscious self is the feeling I always have of a foreign presence external to my body. It is sometimes so definitely characterized that I could point to its exact position. This impression of presence is impossible to describe. It varies in intensity and clearness according to the personality from whom the writing professes to come. If it is someone whom I love, I feel it immediately, before any writing has come. My heart seems to recognize it. In an earlier book of mine, I have cited at full length a curious case, a presence felt by a blind man. The presence was that of the figure of a gray, bearded man, dressed in a pepper and salt suit, squeezing himself under the crack of the door and moving across the floor of the room towards the sofa. The blind subject of this quasi-hallucination is an exceptionally intelligent reporter. He is entirely without internal visual imagery and cannot represent light or colors to himself, and is positive that his other senses, hearing, etc., were not involved in this false perception. It seems to have been an abstract conception rather, with the feelings of reality and spatial outwardness directly attached to it. In other words, a fully objectified and exteriorized idea. And I can practice this with shows. I can take the image on the show or on the screen or in a book or whatever and put part of it somewhere else. Or I can morph it or change its color, flip its direction. Well, at first you kind of form doubles and then you kind of work with that. But then there's beings that are a little bit different than your projected imaginations, if you experience the difference. Such cases, taken along with others, would be too tedious for quotation, seem sufficiently to prove the existence in our mental machinery of a sense of present reality more diffused in general than that which our special senses yield. For the psychologists, The tracing of the organic seat of such a feeling would form a pretty problem. Nothing could be more natural than to connect it with the muscular sense, with the feeling that our muscles were innervating themselves for action. Whatsoever thus innervated our activity, or made our flesh creep, our senses are what do so oftenest might then appear real or present, even though it were but an abstract idea. But with such vague conjectures, we have no concern at present, for our interest lies with the faculty rather than with its organic seat. Well, if you active, that's why it's important. Well, the organic seat is sort of the faculty, right? But the how that physical center does that. So this is how we find that part of our body or brain reads this chemical or produces this chemical and or stores it or whatever. And that's why we need to work on our physical health when we're involving ourselves mystically and stuff too. Like all positive affections of consciousness, the sense of reality has its negative counterpart in the shape of a feeling of unreality by which persons may be haunted, and of which one sometimes hears complaint. When I reflect on the fact that I have made my appearance by accident upon a globe itself, whirled through space as the sport of the catastrophes of the heavens, says Madame Ackermann, when I see myself surrounded by beings as ephemeral and incomprehensible as I am myself, and all excitedly pursuing pure chimeras, I experience a strange feeling of being in a dream. It seems to me as if I have loved and suffered, and that ere long I shall die in a dream. My last word will be, I have been dreaming. And that when I reflect to I've been dreaming, Pensée d'un solitaire, page 66. And remember this phrase when you touch doors or going through passageways and focus on your eyes. Try it. See what it does to your dreams, you know? And who was it? Marcus Cato, or I forget the Greek spelling, so I don't know how you're supposed to pronounce that, but he would say that if people eat in a way that's easier on their stomach, they'll dream too much. It's like, no, it's not that you dream too much. Perhaps you can't control what you're dreaming of and dream of the wrong thing, focus on the wrong things or something, but, you know, or don't know what to do with dreams. But dreaming too much? No, I don't believe in that. Just like loving too much. And anyways, in another lecture, we shall see how morbid melancholy, in this sense of the unreality of things, may become carking pain and even lead to suicide. We may now lay it down as certain that in the distinctively religious sphere of experience, many persons, how many we cannot tell, possess the objects of their belief, not in the form of mere conceptions which their intellect accepts as true, but rather in the form of quasi-sensible realities, directly apprehended, as his sense of the real presence of these objects fluctuates. So the believer alternates between warmth and coldness in his faith. Other examples will bring this home to one better than abstract description, so I proceeded immediately to cite some. The first example is a negative one, deploring the loss of the sense in question. I have extracted it from an account given me by a scientific man of my acquaintance of his religious life. It seems to me to show clearly that the feeling of reality may be something more like a sensation than an intellectual operation, properly so called. And I don't see where the quote is, but between 20 and 30, I gradually became more and more agnostic and irreligious, yet I cannot say that I ever lost that indefinite consciousness which Herbert Spencer describes so well of an absolute reality behind phenomena. For me, this reality was not the pure unknowable of Spencer's philosophy, for although I had ceased my childish prayers to God, and never prayed to it in a formal manner, yet my more recent experience shows me to have been in a relation to it, which practically was the same thing as prayer. whenever I had any trouble, especially when I had conflict with other people, especially domestically or in the way of business, or when I was depressed in spirits or anxious about affairs, I now recognize that I used to fall back for support upon this curious relation I felt myself to be in to this fundamental cosmic it was on my side, or I was on its side, however you please to term it, in the particular trouble, and it always strengthened me and seemed to give me endless vitality to feel its underlying and supportive presence. In fact, it was an unfailing fountain of living justice, truth, and strength, to which I instinctively turned at times of weakness, and it always brought me out. I know now that it was a personal relation I was in to it. Because of late years, the power of communicating with it has left me, and I am conscious of a perfectly definite loss. I used never to fail to I used never to fail to find it when I turned to it. Then came a set of years when sometimes I found it, and then again I would be wholly unable to make connection with it. I remember many occasions on which, at night in bed, I would be unable to get to sleep on account of worry. I turned this way and that in the darkness, and groped mentally for the familiar sense of the higher mind of my mind, which always seemed to be close at hand, as it were, closing the passage and yielding support. But there was no electric current. A blank was there instead of it. I couldn't find anything. Now, at the age of nearly 50, my power of getting into connection with it has entirely left me, or at least conscious knowing thereof, right? And I have to confess that a great help has gone out of my life. Life has become curiously dead and indifferent, and I can now see that my old experience was probably exactly the same thing as the prayers of the Orthodox, only I did not call them by that name. What I have spoken of as it was practically not Spencer's unknowable, but just my own instinctive and individual God, whom I relied upon for higher sympathy, but whom somehow I have lost. Now, whether divinity itself or mythology in general or whatever, you certainly have to, or certainly could or should do the make the personal connection, right? Nothing is more common in the pages of religious biography than the way in which the seasons of lively and difficult faith are described as alternating. Probably every religious person has the recollection of a particular crisis in which a directer vision of the truth, a direct perception perhaps of a living God's existence, swept in and overwhelmed the languor of the more ordinary belief. In James Russell Lowell's correspondence, there is a brief memorandum of an experience of this kind. Now, I would wonder with what the guy meant by childish, right? I had a revelation last Friday evening. I was at Mary's, and happening to say something of the presence of spirits of whom I said I was often dimly aware. Mr. Putnam entered into an argument with me on spiritual matters. As I was speaking, the whole system rose up before me like a vague destiny looming from the abyss. I never before so clearly felt the Spirit of God in me and around me. The whole room seemed to me full of God. The air seemed to waver to and fro with the presence of something I knew not what. I spoke with the calmness and clearness of a prophet. I cannot tell you what this revelation was. I have not yet studied it enough, but I shall perfect it one day, and then you shall hear it and acknowledge its grandeur. And that's, I had a revelation to its grandeur, is from the letters of Lowell 1:75. Here is a longer and more developed experience from a manuscript communication by a clergyman. I take it from Starbucks manuscript collection. I remember the night, and almost the very spot on the hilltop where my soul opened out, as it were, into the infinite, and there was a rushing together of the two worlds, the inner and the outer. It was deep calling into deep, the deep that my own struggle had opened within, being answered by the unfathomable deep without. Reaching beyond the stars, I stood alone with Him who had made me, and all the beauty of the world, and love and sorrow, and even temptation. I did not seek Him, but felt the perfect unison of my spirit with His. The ordinary sense of things around me faded. For the moment, nothing but an ineffable joy and exaltation remained. It is impossible fully to describe the experience. It was like the effect of some great orchestra, when all the separate notes have melted into one swelling harmony that leaves the listener conscious of nothing save that his soul is being wafted upwards and almost bursting with its own emotion. The perfect stillness of the night was thrilled by a more solemn silence. The darkness held a presence that was all the more felt because it was not seen. I could not any more have doubted that He was there than I was. Indeed, I felt myself to be, if possible, the less real of the two. My highest faith in God and truest idea of Him were then born in me. I have stood upon the mount of vision since, and felt the eternal round about me, but never since has there come quite the same stirring of the heart. Then, if ever, I believe I stood face to face with God, and was born anew of His Spirit. There was, as I recall it, no sudden change of thought or of belief, except that my early crude conception had, as it were, burst into flower. There was no destruction of the old, but a rapid, wonderful unfolding. Since that time, no discussion that I have heard of the proofs of God's existence has been able to shake my faith. Having once felt the presence of God's Spirit, I have never lost it again for long. My most assuring evidence of His existence is deeply rooted in that hour of vision, in the memory of that supreme experience, and in the conviction gained from reading and reflection that something the same has come to all who have found God. I am aware that it may justly be called mystical. I am not enough acquainted with philosophy to defend it from that or any other charge. I feel that in writing of it I have overlaid it with words rather than put it clearly to your thought, but such as it is, I have described it as carefully as I now am able to do. Here is another document, which, even more definite in character, which, the writer being a Swiss, I translate it from the French original. And he borrows it with Professor Flournoy's permission from his rich collection of psychological documents. I was in perfect health. We were on our 6th day of tramping, and in good training. We had come the day before from Sixte to Trent by Bouet. I felt neither fatigue, hunger, nor thirst, and my state of mind was equally healthy. I had at Floraz good news from home. I was subject to no anxiety, either near or remote, for we had a good guide, and there was not a shadow of uncertainty about the road we should follow. I can best describe the condition in which I was by calling it a state of equilibrium. When all at once I experienced a feeling of being raised above myself, I felt the presence of God. I tell of the thing just as I was conscious of it, as if His goodness and His power were penetrating me altogether. The throb of emotion was so violent that I could barely tell the boys to pass on and not wait for me. I then sat down on a stone, unable to stand any longer, and my eyes overflowed with tears. I thank God that, in the course of my life, He had taught me to know Him, that He sustained my life, and took pity both on the insignificant creature and on the sinner that I was. I begged Him ardently that my life might be consecrated to the doing of His will. I felt His reply, which was that I should do His will from day to day, in humility and poverty, leaving Him, the Almighty God, to be judge of whatever I should sometime be called to bear witness more conspicuously. Then slowly the ecstasy left my heart. That is, I felt that God had withdrawn the communion from which He had granted, and I was able to walk on. But very slowly, so strongly, was I still possessed by the interior emotion. Besides, I had wept uninterruptedly for several minutes. My eyes were swollen, and I did not wish my companions to see me. The state of ecstasy may have lasted 4 or 5 minutes. although it seemed at the time to last much longer. My comrades waited for me 10 minutes at the cross of Barine, but I took about 25 or 30 minutes to join them. For as well as I can remember, they said that I had kept them back for about half an hour. The impression had been so profound that in climbing slowly the slope, I asked myself if it were possible that Moses on Sinai could have had a more intimate communication with God. I think it well to add that in this ecstasy of mine, God had neither form, color, odor, nor taste. Moreover, that the feeling of his presence was accompanied with no determinate localization. It was rather as if my personality had been transformed by the presence of a spiritual spirit. But the more I seek words to express this intimate intercourse, the more I feel the impossibility of describing the thing by any of our usual images. At bottom, the expression most apt to render what I felt is this: God was present. Though invisible, he fell under no one of my senses, yet my consciousness perceived him. Now, so strong will be the experience of even like, scriptural passages that we kind of, it's like what we experienced being, more profound than that, The adjective mystical is technically applied most often to states that are of brief duration. Of course, such hours of rapture as the last two persons describe are mystical experiences of which in a later lecture I shall have much to say. Meanwhile, here is the abridged record of another mystical or semi-mystical experience. In a mind evidently framed by nature for ardent piety, I owe it to Starbuck's collection. The lady who gives the account is the daughter of a man well known in his time as a writer against Christianity. The suddenness of her conversion shows how well the native sense of God's presence must be to certain minds. She relates that she was brought up in entire ignorance of Christian doctrine, but when in Germany, after being talked to by Christian friends, she read the Bible and prayed, and finally the plan of salvation flashed upon her like a stream of light. To this day, she writes, I cannot understand dallying with religion and the commands of God. The very instant I heard my father's calling unto me, my heart bounded in recognition. I ran, I stretched forth my arms, I cried aloud, Here I am, my Father. O happy child, what should I do? Love me, answered my God. I do, I cried passionately. Come unto me, called my Father. I will. My heart panted. Did I stop to ask a single question? Not one. It never occurred to me to ask whether I was good enough, or to hesitate over my unfitness, or to find out what I thought of his church, or to wait until I should be satisfied. Satisfied? I was satisfied. Had I not found my God and my Father? Did he not love me? Had he not called me? Was there not a church into which I might enter? Since then, I have had direct answers to prayer, so significant as to be almost like talking with God. And hearing his answer, the idea of God's reality has never left me for one moment. Here is still another case, the writer being a man aged 27, in which the experience, probably almost as characteristic, is less vividly described. Now, one of the things that people would rush to, you could say, is they're going to tend to rush towards what they were raised with, or their own issues, or something like this. It's like there was nothing in experience to say this, this father and child sort of thing in relation to God. But things start with the relationship, or at least they start better with the relationship, the mother stage, rather than the father stage of the roles and the skills, although that may be more essential and that may be where you're trying to get to. And the child stage, if you get that, that's where you have the further development, what of your society, your parents and your society to leave aside, and what to accomplish for yourself, realize and actualize, beliefs and actions. But